The attack on Venezuela did not begin on the night of January 3rd. That night was only the moment when preparation became visible. At 2 a.m., the sky over Caracas fractured into light. Power grids failed. Air defenses went silent. Within hours, the president of a sovereign state was gone. But none of this was improvised. No empire moves this fast without rehearsal. What the world witnessed was not escalation. It was an execution. 18 months earlier, the outcome had already been decided, and Venezuela, already hollowed by years of decay, was chosen not because it was strong, but because it was weak, in exactly the right way. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. For most of the 20th century, this should have guaranteed stability, leverage, and security. It did not, because oil is not power. Institutions are. In the early 2000s, oil money replaced governance. Revenues flowed directly into political loyalty, not infrastructure. When prices were high, inefficiency was invisible. When prices fell, the state had nothing beneath it. The system worked only as long as the global market cooperated. When it stopped cooperating, Venezuela had no second layer, no diversified economy, no independent judiciary, no credible central bank, no functioning currency discipline. Oil did not strengthen the state, it delayed its collapse. Hugo Chavez understood one thing perfectly: money buys time. His revolution was not built on production, but on redistribution. Social programs expanded rapidly, funded by oil exports at historic highs. Political loyalty became a substitute for institutional competence. This model created two illusions. First, that sovereignty could be purchased through rhetoric alone. Second, that foreign dependence disappears when you denounce it loudly enough. In reality, Venezuela became more dependent than ever on oil prices, on imports, on external financing, on global logistics it could not control. When Chavez died, the illusion died with him. What remained was a system that required perfect conditions to survive, and was entering an era where conditions would never again be perfect. Nicolás Maduro did not inherit power. He inherited structural failure. Oil prices collapsed. Production declined. Corruption metastasized. Capital fled. Skilled labor emigrated. The currency imploded. Hyperinflation was not a surprise. It was mathematics. When a government finances itself by printing money while production collapses, the currency becomes a lie no one agrees to believe anymore. Sanctions accelerated the decline, but they did not create it. The damage was already internal. By the early 2020s, Venezuela existed in a permanent emergency state, economically paralyzed, politically isolated, socially exhausted, and that made it strategically vulnerable. Sanctions are often described as pressure. In reality, they are a cage. Once imposed at scale, sanctions do not force reform, they eliminate options. By 2024, Venezuela could not freely sell its oil, access capital markets, insure tankers, or stabilize its currency. Every workaround increased dependency on intermediaries: China, Russia, shadow traders, opaque financial channels. Each workaround reduced sovereignty further. The state survived by improvisation, not resilience, and improvisation is visible to intelligence agencies. Washington understood something simple: Venezuela no longer had economic depth. Any shock, financial, military, or political, would cascade instantly. This was no longer a country, it was a pressure system. Publicly, the United States framed Venezuela as a criminal state: narco-trafficking, corruption, electoral fraud, human rights violations. Privately, the assessment was colder. Venezuela was strategically isolated, economically exhausted, and diplomatically expendable. There was no NATO obligation, no mutual defense treaty, no credible military deterrent, and crucially, no unified international coalition willing to fight over it. This is how targets are selected, not by moral outrage, by cost-benefit analysis. Military operations do not begin with missiles, they begin with language. By mid-2024, U.S. policy documents stopped discussing engagement and began discussing resolution. Naval patrols in the Caribbean increased under anti-drug justifications. Surveillance flights multiplied. Sanctions enforcement tightened. Diplomatic isolation was normalized. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, nothing that triggered headlines. But the framework was being assembled. In parallel, legal groundwork expanded: criminal indictments, asset seizures, international warrants, the transformation of a head of state into a prosecutable individual. Once that line is crossed, force becomes bureaucratically easier. This was not preparation for war, it was preparation for inevitability. Empires do not act when conditions are perfect, they act when delay becomes a risk. By late 2025, three factors converged. First, Venezuela's internal cohesion was visibly deteriorating. Second, global energy markets were tightening, increasing the strategic value of supply control. Third, rival powers China and Russia were distracted elsewhere. This was not opportunism, it was timing. History does not reward hesitation, it punishes it. The strike was designed to be overwhelming, brief, and psychologically decisive. Not an invasion, not occupation, extraction, air defenses neutralized, command centers disabled, communications disrupted, special operations units moved faster than rumor, Within hours, the Venezuelan presidency ceased to function as a command structure. The objective was not territorial control, it was decapitation. Remove the head, let the body convulse. This is modern intervention doctrine, minimal footprint, maximal shock. Maduro was removed with speed that left no room for negotiation. One moment he existed as a symbol of defiance. Next, he had a logistical problem. The symbolism was intentional. Power does not need to explain itself when it demonstrates itself. The message was not aimed at Venezuela. It was aimed outward. When the operation ended, Venezuela did not stabilize. It fragmented. Leadership removal did not restore electricity, food supply, or currency credibility. It did not repair trust or rebuild institutions. It simply removed gravity. Power vacuums do not remain empty. They are filled with fear, and fear travels faster than governance. This was the first direct U.S. military removal of a sitting Latin American head of state in decades. Not covert, not deniable, not ambiguous. And once such a line is crossed, it does not reset. It has become a precedent. Every power watching understood this immediately, because the question was no longer about Venezuela. It was about what the world had just accepted as normal again. By sunrise, Caracas was quiet, too quiet. The silence after intervention is never peace. It is anticipation. Venezuela had lost its president, the world had lost its restraint, and somewhere, far from Caracas, other capitals began recalculating. Because when one state is removed this way, others start asking a dangerous question: could this happen to us? By dawn, Venezuela had not surrendered. It had stalled. Government buildings stood intact but hollow. Orders were issued without certainty they would be followed. Ministries functioned on inertia, not authority. Power existed on paper, not in practice. This is the most dangerous phase of collapse. Not revolution, not civil war, but suspension. When a state continues to exist, but no longer commands belief, markets understand this instinctively. So do foreign governments. And above all, so do rival powers watching from afar, because uncertainty is contagious. If this were only about Venezuela, the story would already be over. It isn't. The removal of a leader is not what alarmed other powers. Leaders fall all the time. What mattered was how it happened, how quickly, and how little resistance followed. No UN authorization, no coalition force, no prolonged justification, just action. This wasn't diplomacy failing. It was diplomacy being bypassed. That changes calculations everywhere. In Beijing, the concern was not ideological. It was structural. China had spent 2 decades building influence in Venezuela quietly. Loans, infrastructure deals, oil for debt arrangements. Not empire, leverage. Those agreements were designed around stability, not spectacle. Now the underlying assumption was gone. If a U.S. operation could nullify leadership overnight, then contracts, debt guarantees, and long-term supply arrangements were suddenly political fiction. For China, the fear wasn't losing Venezuelan oil, it was losing predictability. And predictability is the foundation of Chinese global strategy. China does not fear invasion. It fears normalization, because once unilateral regime removal is tolerated in one region, it becomes defensible elsewhere. Not immediately, not openly, but quietly, case by case. And China governs territories whose status depends entirely on the idea that force is restrained by rules. Rules just weakened. That is why Beijing condemned the strike without escalating militarily. Not weakness calculation. The response would not be immediate. It would be cumulative. Moscow's reaction was louder. Words like aggression and neo-colonialism returned to official statements. But behind the rhetoric sat a harsher truth. Russia could not intervene. Not directly. Not credible. Its resources were stretched. Its priorities elsewhere. Venezuela was influenced, not survived. But influence lost publicly is dangerous, because credibility is not local. If Russia allows an allied government to be removed without consequence, every other partner notices. So Russia responded the only way it could, by reframing the event. Russia understands something the West often underestimates. Perception is terrain. The goal was not to restore Maduro. That was impossible. The goal was to brand the operation as illegitimate, destabilizing, reckless, to make the cost reputational rather than military, to ensure that even if the U.S. succeeded tactically, it paid strategically. This is a modern great power conflict, not tanks versus tanks, narratives versus legitimacy. Across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, reactions followed a familiar pattern: condemnation without intervention. History weighs heavily here. Many of these states remember what stability operations once meant. They have learned that regime change rarely ends with reconstruction. They see a pattern: economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, legal delegitimization, force. The sequence was recognizable, and recognition breeds resistance. Not necessarily today, but eventually. Critics asked, why didn't China or Russia respond militarily? Because this was not a battlefield designed for them. Venezuela is geographically distant, politically fragmented, and strategically asymmetric. Any intervention would be reactive, not controlling, and reactive power loses. Instead, the response shifted to longer timelines, energy markets, trade alignments, institutional friction. This is where modern power actually moves. Markets reacted before diplomats finished speaking. Oil prices spiked, not because supply vanished, but because trust did. Insurance premiums rose. Shipping hesitated. Contracts were paused. Investors hate ambiguity more than loss. And Venezuela had just become the most ambiguous asset on Earth. Energy traders understood something crucial. If supply can be seized politically, it cannot be priced rationally. That uncertainty spreads. Venezuela's debts did not disappear with its leadership. They became more dangerous. Who honors them? Who renegotiates them? Who controls the revenue stream? Debt assumes continuity. Intervention breaks it. This places pressure not only on Venezuela, but on every creditor exposed to politically unstable regions. Risk recalibrates globally, and risk never shrinks quietly. No global mobilization followed. No alliances activated. But the military adjusted posture, surveillance increased, exercises expanded, contingency plans were updated. Not because war was imminent, but because assumptions had changed. When force is demonstrated without catastrophic consequence, it becomes a viable tool again. Deterrence shifts. For Washington, disengagement now would be worse than intervention. Withdrawal would signal hesitation. Hesitation invites challenge. Once power asserts itself, it must either consolidate or retreat, and retreat invites resistance everywhere. This is the imperial trap. You act to reduce risk, then action creates new risks you must manage. Venezuela is no longer a problem to solve, it is a position to hold. The real conflict will not be fought in Caracas. It will be fought through access. Access to energy, access to financing, access to shipping lanes. Control the flows and you control outcomes. This is where major powers are already repositioning, but not publicly, but permanently. They cannot afford not to. Walking away concedes precedent. Remaining engaged, even indirectly, signals refusal to normalize unilateral force. This does not mean escalation. It means friction, diplomatic obstruction, alternative trade networks, strategic patience. The goal is not reversal, it is containment. This has happened before. Iran, 1953, Chile, 1973, Panama, 1989. Different eras, different justifications, same structure. Economic pressure creates fragility. Political isolation delegitimizes leadership. Force resolves the question. The difference now is speed and global visibility. The post-Cold War order was slow. This one is not. Information travels instantly. Markets react in seconds. Narratives form before facts settle. This compresses decision-making. Compression increases error, and errors between great powers do not remain local. No major power believes this stops here. They believe it tests something. How much resistance follows? How unified is the response? How quickly attention moves on? These answers shape the next decision, and there will be a next decision. The deepest fear is not war. It is normalization. That borders can be rewritten without consensus. That sovereignty is conditional. That power speaks first and explains later. Once that belief takes root, restraint erodes. Venezuela did not collapse because it was invaded. It collapsed because it was hollow. But what followed matters more, because the world did not respond with unity. It responded with calculation. And calculation is how great power conflict begins. Venezuela is not the story, it is the signal. Fade to black,